We have one more person joining, just a second. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this seminar series organized by the Empathic Computing Lab. I am your host, Aladdin, and our distinguished speaker for today is Jun Nishida, who is currently a postdoc fellow at the University of Chicago. Jun investigates tangible interfaces, wearable interfaces, embodiment, and social experiences. He has done a lot of research since 2015 in Japan, is that correct? And
yes.
The title of the talk is Communicating Embodied Experiences Among People Using Wearable Devices. The talk will be roughly an hour, followed by a brief questions and answer sessions. Please join me to welcome Jun. Thank you.
Thank you for your great introduction. First, I'd like to thank Professor Mark Binghurst and Aladdin for this great remote Zoom seminar. And I am Jun Nishida. I'm a postdoc at University of Chicago Human-Computer Integration Laboratory. And today it is a great honor for me to share my research interests through this Zoom seminar. But today, I would like to talk how we can open up new channel for communicating our embodied experiences among people using wearable devices. So first, let me start with a very simple example of my work. So this is a wearable device that can shift down your visual perspective into a lower stature, like a 5-year-old children. So wearers can look around the surrounding environment from a lower stature in a real world. But you might wonder why I started making such device. And to start off, let me take a look at a trend in the evolution of communication tools that could help explaining our body experiences to another person. So, of course, the very basic communication media is text. We use books and Slacks nowadays to communicate our subjective experiences. And in terms of the embodied experience, some institutions even provide datasets of average human body dimensions in a country for assisting product ergonomics evaluation. And also, of course, videos are the most useful communication tools when it comes to communicating our bodily emotions. So Zoom is now used for remote yoga class, and motion capture systems are used to record and replay during Olympic game broadcasting. And of course, recent years, interactive visual tools are also widely used, such as these 3D human model in the CAD software with pointing devices for product design. Of course, and a first-person perspective video with head-mount display is proposed for more immersive visual experience, but with a little bit limited interactivity. But these all work well, and these tools have successfully communicated verbal aspects of human activity over distance in fast and quantitative manner. But let me show you simple examples where modalities these communication tools can convey are not enough. For instance, rehabilitation. So actually, this is a lower limb exoskeleton developed in my previous university in Japan called University of Tsukuba. And it is very important to communicate our muscle activity between therapists and patients, which is very hard to explain by words. And the only thing therapists can rely on are visuals and verbal cue from patients. But physical experience is about like muscle tension and its location, and also joint rigidity, which is completely invisible from our eyes. And all these things are not visible from our eyes and also hard to explain using words. And these are not supported by the tools we just saw. But I believe communicating invisible bodily conditions, bodily experience, helps not only understanding the condition of patients, but also instructing patients from therapists during the rehabilitation. And here's another example. Not only visible thing, but also visible interactions that involve subjective feelings are still hard to understand for someone else. For instance, in a product designing, how can we guess whether such smaller person is feeling uncomfortable or fatigued while grasping some objects or trying to reach the handrail in this picture? So having ergonomics evaluation from a different perspective is always hard. And to understand this, not only hearing the experience from the target users, but also designers should use their own body to understand, such as reaching to the product, grasping the product, then moving the product by themselves, but through a different body. And this would bring more subjective and affective understanding of the product usage. So to tackle these challenges for communicating non-verbal aspects of human activity among people, I have been developing these 3 devices. So let's get into the detail of each project. And I would like to start from communicating smaller person experience. So as I showed in the teaser movie, so this is a wearable device that can change the height of your eyesight into a lower stature, which is 5 years old, average 5 years old of Japanese children. And users can interact with surrounding people and objects. And it consists of fisheye cameras, head-mount displays with head tracking for controlling field of view by using their own head orientation in real time. So this visual translator device equips 2 of 180-degree fisheye cameras and 2 microphones, and also motion sensors to detect body orientation and head orientation. And these are all connected to a laptop in a backpack. The software is configured by Open Frameworks environment, which is based on C++ and OpenGL, which creates stereo rectified images on a head-mount display from captured spherical images. And the latency was measured as around 120 milliseconds, which is still sufficient for preserving the user's sense of agency, which is a feeling that the body and the limb users can see in the head-mount display are controlled by the user by themselves. But this could be done much faster by using hardware image processors such as FPGA. So as applications, our device can be used as educational tool for teachers, medical staffs, and parents to help them to understand how children interact in a nursing school and classroom. And also as a design tool for product and spatial designers, such as in stores, museums, or hospitals, like such. And you may think that there would be a similar project achieved in VR, or why this should be in real world. And it is true, and there is a research achieved in VR, and they investigated how such body changes affects our implicit attitude in a VR environment. But our approach achieves these bodily changes in a real world that allows users to interact with real people and objects. And this enables users to have smaller person experience in their own existing workplace and to notice the difference by the perspective height by comparing with their existing knowledge. So this is why I think changing bodies in the real world is very important. And now you would wonder whether this really changes our perceived height or not. And to prove this, we investigated from three different research perspectives, which are the changes in the user's perception, action, and interaction in real world. So let me start from the personal space experiment. So here shows experiment setup. So our hypothesis is that imagine when there is someone approaching to you who looks much, much bigger than you, then you would feel uncomfortable or even scary. Then people's personal space, which we can say a safe zone, could be enlarged. And we first measured these personal space changes by the perspective height changes for evaluating whether their perceived height is shortened or not. We used a stop distance method to measure personal space, which is commonly used in psychological studies. And we did this study in a nursing school with actual nursing teachers in Japan. And here is the results. So when their eye level are shifted down, their personal space was significantly enlarged compared to when they have the camera on the usual height, which is on the head. And the participants mentioned that the approaching experimenter looks bigger than usual, and also stated that the approaching experimenter looked a bit oppressive. So I think these could suggest that such uncomfortable feelings are provided because they perceived themselves as shorter. Next, we also try to prove that body sensation changes through their action, which is handshaking in this case. So the thing is that when I was doing some exhibitions or demonstrations in a museum, I found that visitors raised their hand higher than usual when they try to make a handshake. And I thought this is caused by their perceived shorter height. And I also thought that this could be used as an index to evaluate the strength of the perceived height. So here shows the setup, and there are two conditions. So one is a user just watches a video of handshaking without having the field of view control by using their head orientation, then perform handshake. The other condition, users can observe through the camera, and they can also control the field of view by using their head orientation, then perform a handshake. And here's the results. And it shows that the participants raise their hand significantly higher when they can control their field of view by using their own head orientation. And also, they looked up higher, significantly higher when they can control their field of view. So from these results, it is suggested that when users can actively control their field of lower view, they perceive their height more shorter. And lastly, we conducted interaction experiment to correct more qualitative feedback on their smaller personal experience. So as Professor mentioned, I did interaction observation and also demonstration at the SIGGRAPH and collected questionnaire feedback, including nursing school and hospital. And interestingly, during the observation, we could see many activity, such as surprise reaction, or protective pose, or childlike talking, or intimidating action to the wearer from the surrounding people. So these are not controlled experiment set up, but not only the wearer, but also the surrounding people also changed their interaction styles by regarding the wearers as a smaller persons, such as having, including their attitude or the way of having conversation. So I would like to verify this phenomenon with more controlled setup in the future. We also ask participants to answer their body representation figures from these figures. And 60% of participants stated that their perceived height became shorter. And also some participants reported that only their head moved to lower. I guess this could be a cause because of the spatial mismatch between the eyes and their hands in the system. This shows that the visual device, translation device, achieved to create a lower perspective and the sense of having shorter height. Now, with the visual translation device, we are able to understand the subjective experience of being a smaller person that would help to understand the impression of surrounding spatial design. And we also saw that our visual sensation has a significant effect and role in creating our body sensation. But I think there is one more important factor to understand one's experience, which is our hand. And hands are a very important interface between body and world. So because we confirm the existence of objects and people by touching and interacting, then we learn through hands. So our next challenge was to change our hand in the real world. And here's our solution. So we developed an exoskeleton growth that transforms your hand dimensions into that of 5 years old children, which I presented last year's UIST. So as here you can see, this exoskeleton can miniaturize your hand motions into a smaller size, but it only equips the passive link mechanisms, so users can receive real-time and congruent haptic feedback from the grasped objects. And we made this using a 3D printer. So even with such a small ball, it's very hard to grasp. I also made a very simple restriction wire that can reproduce a shorter reach of the children. And by using this exoskeleton, product designers can understand how a smaller person's reach, grasp, and interact through their own body and actions. And let me show you how I measured whether these changes are perception or not. So our answer was to investigate the changes in a user's size perception with and without using the exoskeleton. So our hypothesis is that when users have a smaller hand, they would feel objects bigger. So we used several diameters of balls like such, and we asked participants to interact them, then also asked them to report the diameter with their own hands. And the results show that the objects were perceived to be larger with the exoskeleton compared to when participants used their own hands, meaning that their size perception has changed by having a smaller hand. And more importantly, we also observed how this device can improve the design process of a toy for children. So in this study, we observed the experience of using the exoskeleton for evaluating ergonomics of a toy trumpet. And we asked them to improve the original design of the trumpet. As an assistive design tool, we provided a 100 dimension sheet with a ruler and the exoskeleton. And participants stated that through the exoskeleton, they could not only for testing ergonomics, but also even to model the crate directly. And they stated that bodily feedback helped them to understand the usability of the original products, and also the design they made. And I think the most important result from this study is that participants could have more confidence when interacting through the exoskeleton compared to when using the data sheet with a ruler of 100 dimensions. And this result could mean that the body experience of being another person is more persuasive for the users. And I believe this exoskeleton successfully communicates the experience of having a smaller hand to another person. So now let's look back again how I started talking about these projects. So I hope you remember that my initial motivation is also to allow therapists and patients to communicate nonverbal knowledge, such as muscle tension, location, and rigidity of body. So I had actually some internship in University of Tsukuba Hospital, and also I had a conversation with neurosurgeons and physical therapists. And I found that communicating this information in real time could be very useful for more accurate rehabilitation planning. So to allow these two persons to communicate about muscle activity, we developed a pair of wearable devices that can share muscle activities like such. So one person can control the other person's muscle in real time by using the biosignal measurement and electrical muscle stimulation. And with this device, they can connect muscles each other, then monitor or even teach how to use muscle through this new communication channel. And to achieve this, we have developed a wearable device that includes an electrode system and wireless communication capability. And that can perform both biosignal measurement and electrical muscle stimulation through the same electrodes. And this allows to both measure and control muscle activity of a user. So there's a technically interesting mechanism in this device. So as I mentioned, this device have to perform biosignal measurement and voltage stimulation through the same pair of electrodes, but in almost same timing. In this case, the weak biosignal will be affected by the high voltage stimulation signal. And to prevent this, I had to implement a discharging circuit after the stimulation is applied. And this shows the electrical model of electrodes and muscles and skins. And the figure on the right side is about timing chart of the operation. So there are 3 electrodes for sensing and stimulating, which is colored in the blue. And when there's a muscle stimulation, these 2 electrodes are activated, and there will be a 35 voltage pulses on the skin through the 2 electrodes. And then the circuit connects all electrodes for 10 milliseconds for eliminating the voltage after the stimulus, because there is some residual voltage in the body. And this mechanism discharges voltage in the body and the circuit. And after this, these 3 electrodes are attached to biosignal amplifiers to acquire electromyogram of muscles for 10 to 20 milliseconds. So the device, this device performs the entire this cycle every 30 to 50 milliseconds, and this allows the simultaneous operation of the measurement and also the stimulation at the same through the same electrodes. So now I got a muscle communication device, but for applying to a motor learning scenario like rehabilitation, there are several things we need to know, such as while muscle activities are combined on a one person, can 2 users synchronize their contraction timing, or is just sharing muscles enough for teaching motions? Also, when muscle activities are combined at the same time, can a user distinguish own muscle activity and the other's muscle activity provided by the electrical muscle stimulation? So the first, we observed whether users can synchronize rhythmic muscle activities, such as in a situation of hand rehabilitation. So these 2 persons cannot see each other and cannot hear anything. And at first, their rhythmic motion is not matched. But after 5 to 8 seconds, their rhythmic motion is synchronized by only sharing muscle activities. And this result is very interesting in that this muscle communication could be used for the blind or hearing impaired patients who cannot see or hear during the rehabilitation. And next, let's see whether users can distinguish own and others' muscle activity or not. And objective of this experiment is to investigate how involuntary muscle contraction provided by electrical muscle stimulation affects the perception of users' voluntary contraction. So during the experiment, involuntary contraction will be presented by electrical muscle stimulation while they are also contracting their own muscles, and ask them to report the perceived rate of the muscle activity. And we found that even they contract voluntarily, they could recognize given muscle activities by EMS. And this means that users can distinguish their own muscle activity and also someone's muscle activities at the same time. And again, there is another case where this device could be useful, which is joint rigidity, as I mentioned. And as similar to one muscle activity, controlling joint rigidity, such as this wrist joint rigidity, involves a pair of muscles on forearm. So I also tested with 2 sets of input and output electrode pairs on the forearm and see whether it can communicate joint rigidity by using biosignal measurement and electrical muscle stimulation. So the point is that by applying the electrical muscle stimulation on both sides of the forearm, we can control the stiffness of the wrist joints. And I measure the relationship between reproduced stiffness when certain electrical muscle stimulation is applied, and also biosignal values when try to reproduce certain stiffness on the wrist. And these results mean that we can create a mapping between the measured stiffness from biosignals and also from electrical muscle stimulation values in a linear manner. And I found that it is also feasible to share wrist joint rigidity with our device. So I found a potential in sharing muscle activities using the electrical muscle stimulation, but there is one critical limitation, which is you lose some sense of agency, which is a feeling that you are initiating that action by yourself because your body is involuntarily actuated by the electrical muscle stimulation. So as a next step, I investigated the relationship between the timing of the EMS intervention and the sense of agency to preserve that sense, even if a user's body is actuated by the electrical muscle stimulation. So we use a very basic setup where there will be a button, then, excuse me. So we use a basic setup where there will be a button pop up, then user tap it with an assistance of electrical muscle stimulation. And we tested several timings of the EMS assistance. And here are the plot EMS of EMS timings on the x-axis and reported sense of agency on the y-axis. So when the assistance timing is too fast, something like here, user has no agency. And when the assistance is too late, user has agency, but there's no successful outcome. But we found that there is a point that, okay, it works. But if we found that there is a certain point for both preserving the faster reaction time by the EMS and preserving the sense of agency, which is EMS assistance at 80 milliseconds faster than the user's original reaction time. So by using this parameter, even the user's body is actuated, the user can still feel that sense of agency, which is very important for preserving the motivation and learning effect while receiving the electrical muscle stimulation assistance. And this result would be very useful for achieving the higher sense of agency of a patients while sharing muscle activity with someone else. So in conclusion, so I hope these devices can communicate the nonverbal aspects of human activity I mentioned in the beginning and foster the mutual understanding in the fields of rehabilitation, design, and education. And also, as I mentioned in the beginning, the existing tools are very useful in communicating verbal and visual knowledge in a fast and quantitative manner. And although each has different targets and benefits, adding one more modality, which is bodily sensation with voluntary interactions, would provide new knowledge to us. And I believe that communicating both these verbal and non-verbal aspects by social and physical interaction through a different body in the real world would provide more realistic and persuasive communication of one's subjective experience. And finally, in these projects, I successfully changed our body and I successfully changed our perception and interaction. But I believe that this also has a potential in changing our perspectives toward different people or how you think toward other person that might change our empathetic feelings. So as for next steps, I'd like to develop this further for not only changing our bodies itself, but also change our cognition to achieve more nonverbal communication modalities among people. So as one example of this concept, I have been proposing another use of the wearable electrical muscle stimulation device. So actually that device is also capable of reproducing the Parkinson's hand tremor by applying the electrical muscle stimulation on our hands, like such. And by changing the embodied property of healthy subjects into symptom conditions, product designers would be able to evaluate their products by using their own body. We haven't conducted a very controlled study. However, demo visitors were able to evaluate which spoon form is suitable for meal based on their embodied tremor experience. And I would like to investigate this topic more. And as another nonverbal communication project, I'm making another exoskeleton that can share hand gestures. So as here you can see someone is trying to learn piano, but it requires very complex finger gestures for beginners. But now our exoskeleton can connect each finger by custom passive linkages and transmit finger motions to those of learner. And I think this would be useful for teaching piano melodies with precise timing, force, and chords combination through the passive linkages. And you might wonder, you might think that this looks like a complete puppet from the teacher to students, but it actually equips variable length linkages, and which this can change the transmission ratio of the finger pulse from the teacher to a student. And I think changing the transmission ratio of the force can adjust the feeling of the agency of the learning student. So now we are trying to propose a new paradigm to learn a gesture based on the findings from the previous exoskeleton project and agency researches. So lastly, I'd like to thank my former advisor, Professor Kenji Suzuki in U Scuba and Professor Pedro Lopez in U Chicago, and co-authors. And if you have a question, I'd like to have, I'm happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jun. That was exciting research you shared with us. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas and thoughts. Now the time for question and answer. So if anyone has a question, please go ahead. Ishan?
Hi, Jun. Thank you so much for the very interesting research. I'm interested in your couple of slides where you synchronize the muscle movement. So especially with the sense of agency, I know this is very important psychologically speaking, where people have to have like a willpower or being able to control something. I'm wondering, because what I'm doing here in the lab with Mark is, as people communicate in VR, so I'm investigating as they collaborate, to what extent and how the brains of two people, when they communicate in VR, are synchronized to each other. So because this is related to synchronization, I'm wondering, as you measure the synchronization of the muscles, and typical sort of muscle, did you find any interesting result where you also measure the brain synchronizations? Because muscle movement is very much related to the motor cortex area activity usually. So because it will help also later on, if we are able to capture the sense of agency from the muscles, then for many times neuroscientists have been trying to measure the sense of agency instead of using the muscles. They have been looking at the brain activity. So I'm wondering whether did you find something interesting from the neuroscientific perspective? Because if we combine them all together, I think it would be much more complete. I think it will be much more useful, I think, in looking at the synchronization area, which is very interesting, I think.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So we are also pretty interested in this topic on the relationship between electrical muscle stimulation and agency. So from this synchronization study, I found that we humans are pretty egocentric. I mean, we are very good at making very reasonable some consensus that can justify our actions, which means when people are trying to control my arms, then share the movement in real time, they say that, oh, it's like a extension on my arm, something like that, and it's very how can I say, very plastic to incorporate others' muscle activity. That's one thing I felt during the demonstration. And also, I didn't introduce all of papers we did, but there's one more paper which investigates about the relationship between the strengths of the agency during the EMS and the learning effect. And if the EMS assistance is too fast or too late, there's no neural adaptation that can enhance our physical faster reaction. So I think through these kind of research, the users are pretty based on the motivation and also the outcome from the actions. And I think these parameters are very useful for designing the interaction in VR as well, such as providing some fake outcome or making the user's comfort feels very comfortable, So I think this kind of parameters can used for the faster learning effect.
I see. All right. Like in the future, how are you going to see this this recent synchronization of the muscles to which directions you're aiming to the flow more, like maybe for more rehabilitation or for like training or educational stuff? I'm just wondering how you
yes, so
which directions.
primarily I was aiming to apply these technologies to rehabilitation scenarios because it always a problem to maintain the patient's motivation while receiving the very direct physical instructions from the therapist. So I think by measuring the patient's intention and also providing the electrical study, we also found that this also can be used for the esports training, for instance. So when you get some items in a game, then you get a simulation with EMS that train your finger tapping with certain EMS simulation. Then it actually faster your reaction during while having like a very game which requires very super fast response, even after removing the electrical muscle stimulation. So I think this can be also used as a training tool, but also as a entertainment factor.
I see. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Gun.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Jun, for the inspiring talk. I have a question regarding the exoskeleton you showed towards the end of your presentation. You were mentioning it's not simply a mechanical link, but that link can manipulate the strength or the stiffness. Can you explain a little bit more? Are you using actuators or something like that, or is it purely mechanical design that you're using?
I see. That's a great question. So, oops. So you might. So I think you were showing the image of the exoskeleton. So actually, in this picture, that exoskeleton equips motors inside, but it doesn't apply any force to the teacher and user. It's just used for changing the shape of the exoskeleton. So I think it's a bit hard to see, but here's a forward linkage here. Can you see? Well, I can write on Zoom. Okay. I think you are seeing my drawing, I hope. So this mechanism can transmit the finger motion from the teacher to the student, even without the motors embedded inside. And this motor can change the strength of the linkage of here and here. And by changing the ratio of these two linkages, we can control the transmission ratio of the force mechanically. So actually, we don't need to use these motors. We can also change the shape of the exoskeleton manually.
Yeah, that's very clever. I was wondering if it was you were using the actuator to change the force, but you're actually changing the shapes of the link to
yeah, exactly,
different measures. Oh, that's very clever. Thank you very much for explaining that.
The reason I try to use the passive linkages is that so in the previous exoskeleton project about us having a smaller hands, so that exoskeleton also have no actuators and sensors inside. and thanks to the passive linkages, it can transmit the haptic feedback in real time without compromising it. And I think it's very important factor in transmitting haptics information. And I think I saw that these mechanics can also be used for skill transfer.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I had a question at the beginning when you mentioned you had a simulation of a smaller hand. Did you also try a simulation of a bigger hand? Is that?
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't make the bigger hand, but there is a psychology paper that uses the mechanical bigger hand to investigate some mapping changes in the mapping in the brain. So I don't think they use it for something useful, but you may check that paper. I can share that later.
Sounds good. I was wondering if it has the same effect between smaller hand and bigger hand. Or...
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So the one thing we can discuss is that by comparing the bigger exoskeleton and smaller exoskeleton, I think that having smaller hands is more difficult for humans because we generally grow up, then our limb become bigger. So I think it will be interesting to see the difference in bodily change between the bigger exoskeleton and smaller exoskeleton. Thank you for giving me a very interesting idea.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? I have one last question, and I guess it's drawing on the future of your research and perhaps maybe your work at the University of Chicago at the moment. Where do you see the future of your research going, or direction?
Yeah, so as I mentioned briefly, so I have been focusing on changing the body itself, but I think our body and cognition is very tangled, very connected. So I think the wearable technologies can also affect our cognition in the future, and we are trying to achieve this by using the electrical muscle stimulation at first. So there's an ongoing project which is about changing our implicit bias by using some intervention using the electrical muscle stimulation. So the system is pretty simple. So there will be some image pop up, then you choose good or bad. But when you try to choose, there's some electrical muscle stimulation, then changes your choice without your intention. And we are trying to see whether it can change your implicit preference or some impression towards that image. Yeah, by silently changing your choice.
I see. Thank you. Thank you again for sharing this interesting research, and wish you all the best for the future. Also, if you happen to visit New Zealand or Australia, please get in touch. Thanks again.
Definitely. Thank you for inviting. Thank you, everyone. Good night.